The B word is back.
Rachel Reeves knows that Brexit is still a lingering culture war issue. A lot of housing campaigners do too. They think affordability is somehow a property of a house itself. So an affordable house is just affordable. It just somehow is in and of itself. So this is almost like a version of the labor theory of value, where you think value is determined by the number of labor hours contained in a product.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum, Director of Communications here today. I'm joined by our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz, and our Managing Editor, Daniel Freeman. Plenty on the agenda today, not least the B word is back. Wealth taxes are once again up to the top of this week's billing, and we're talking about, is the government going to hit its house building targets? But before we get into all of that, do follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. You can do that for free, or you can become a paid subscriber to get exclusive content, get all of our blogs, podcasts, events, and more straight into your inbox. And if you're watching, please do subscribe, like, and comment. We do rattle through all those comments throughout the week when we can, and we're always interested in your feedback. Now, on to the business of the day. This week, the Treasury has been briefing, and the Chancellor has been leaning in a little bit to those briefings, that the OBR is predicted to downgrade its UK productivity growth forecast ahead of the coming budget, and it's going to blame, among other things, Brexit for this. Daniel, is there credibility to this claim from the OBR if it indeed does come forward?
Well, I'm going to slightly dodge this question by saying it's really, really hard to measure. It isn't just an issue that of the OBR sort of being Ramona's or anything like that. It's just very difficult to compare levels of British productivity today, or actually the 4% figure, the 4% down reduction in productivity figures, is actually a reference to Britain 10 years from now. And what you're trying to do is compare where they think Britain will be 10 years from now to where they think Britain might have been had we remained inside the EU. And that's a really, really difficult task. Our colleague Julian Jessup has written a very good CapEx piece on this two days ago, basically outlining how we don't really know. These figures are quite tricky, but it may well be in the right ballpark. Now that's in part because leaving the EU has resulted in more trade friction with EU countries. That's what everyone expected. That isn't a surprise. The question is, how much do the advantages of being outside the EU balance that out? So some of the advantages are that you're able to have a more independent regulatory regime. So, the EU are coming up with endless proposals to, say, regulate AI or other areas of tech, and Britain has been able to remain slightly outside of that. You also have advantages in terms of trade policy with the rest of the world. So this has particularly come through with the relations with the Trump administration. So Britain's the current trade deal that Britain has is somewhat more favourable with the US than the EU deal, and that's in large part because Britain is just a fairly unthreatening economy from a Trumpian perspective. When a factory closes down in Ohio, there's very rarely going to be a claim, oh, we've been undercut by all this British industry that's stealing our jobs. Like, no one ever says that. We've got for quite a few reasons, partly that's down to government policy. We have a really quite small manufacturing sector. And so that does come with some advantages. But I think what's kind of most interesting about what Rachel Reeves said, she made this statement at the meeting of finance ministers in the IMF, is by mentioning Brexit as a factor in the highly likely OBR's highly likely downgrade in productivity figures from the OBR, which will require a fiscal response from her, is it's kind of part of the breakdown in the political taboo, at least at the very sort of senior levels of the Labour Party, who for basically the last 5 years have really tried to avoid talking about Brexit at all, because on one level they know that the vast majority of Labour members and many of their MPs are very hostile to Brexit, but I think they've correctly interpreted up to this point that because it comes with so much cultural baggage, that if, say, in 2020, Keir Starmer had started going on about Brexit causing various economic problems, he would have been seen as a Ramona. He would have been seen as if, he's implicitly calling people who voted Brexit sort of thick racists or whatever. And they've really tried to avoid that. I think now, because we're almost a decade from the Brexit referendum, we're 5 years away from actually leaving the vote. Brexit has become much less of a cultural signifier, and increasingly voters are viewing it simply as a policy decision that we made, that they look at in those terms.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Kristian, one of the sort of phrases that the Chancellor's using when she's talking about this specific topic and the role of Brexit is she's saying the way in which we left the EU. Mm-hmm. So is there a sense here that even Rachel Reeves is saying real Brexit hasn't been tried?
Well, it gives her some room for maneuver. But in general, I would say it is a bit cynical to blame this on Brexit, because I'm much more, as you know, I'm much more of a Brexit skeptic than our colleague Julian Jessop is. And that's why I would take issue with some of the things he said in that article. But nonetheless, you can be a Brexit skeptic without saying Brexit is specifically to blame for the fiscal situation of this year and of this budget. And I think that's uncontroversial. So the whole argument used to be between the pro-Brexit side, who used to say, well, we know that this is going to cause an initial hit, but then, it's like a long-term investment. Then we will miraculously recover, and the long-term benefits will more than outweigh those initial costs. It's just, well, that part never quite seems to arrive. But okay, that was the argument. Whereas the OBR assessment and, well, most of the assessments that they are summarizing, it's not an assessment of their own, they're summarizing other people's work. They're saying, yes, there is an initial hit, but that's all it is. It doesn't get better later. And I think, okay, that's closer to the truth. But even then, even in that version of events, they're not saying that that this will specifically affect the fiscal situation of the year 2025. So even on this 4% figure, I think the biggest part of that is supposed to have happened already. And therefore, okay, if you go back in time, you can maybe blame things that happened in earlier years on Brexit, but it just wears off and it no longer quite works right now. The reason why she does this is with any other attempt to, say, blame the previous government or some specific decision of a previous government, it would be seen as an excuse. It would be seen as a bit lame. People would, we now have reached a stage where people would say, well, you're the government now, and your honeymoon period is over, so take some responsibility. It's just that Rachel Reeves knows that Brexit is still a lingering culture war issue. It no longer has the salience that it had, say, even 5 years ago. But if you poke it, if you say, well, here's a bad thing and it's because of Brexit, there will be a certain proportion of the electorate, and heavily biased towards her potential voters, who will just be unable to resist that temptation to rekindle the Brexit culture war. There are people who just cannot move on from that, and who really are like the now proverbial Japanese soldiers on the island who keep fighting World War II, even though Imperial Japan no longer exists as a state. And this is a way to try to wake up those people and try to restart a Brexit culture war. Now, where I would, and this is removed from the budget situation, where I would take issue with Julian's assessment is, I think he's overly negative of the OBR summary of the impact assessments. He's right, of course, when he says that this modeling which says Brexit makes the country 4% poorer than it would otherwise have been. Okay, there's nothing special about the figure 4%. That is an average of various estimates. It's just that you have to wonder. You can criticize any individual economic study, but you have to wonder, why do they all earn the same direction? That criticism that modeling has been wrong before, it's not reliable, you can't trust it. That makes sense when you have a situation where the modeling is all over the place, which is true for some issues where you have some studies I've just looked at, for example, migratory responses to a wealth tax, to do a study on that. And there the estimates are really wildly all over the place. You get some studies saying everyone will emigrate, some saying nobody will emigrate. And there you can tell, okay, there's so much variation here. They clearly don't know the specifics. But that's not the case when it comes to the Brexit modelling. Most of the impact assessments that have been done they differ from each other, but within a fairly narrow range. There is a broad consensus that it's not catastrophic, but it's mildly negative. It's not that there are some studies that say this will totally ruin the country, and others that say this will turn us into Singapore. Or Switzerland. It's more they're all within a range of between 0 and 6-7% GDP loss. So that's a fairly narrow range. I say if they all or almost all in that direction, you have to wonder, should you really be in the business of trying to find faults with every single study? And at what point do you have to say, well, the evidence is really against me, and I should just accept that?
If the problem is the way in which we left the EU rather than leaving the EU itself, what could we do now we're out of the EU to sort of change that? And do we think the Labour government is going to grip those opportunities in the way that we would hope?
Yeah, that's a good question, because in some ways Brexit is quite a different policy from something like a wealth tax, because it isn't really a policy. It is opening up a series of policy options. And the analogy that Kristian poo-pooed it before we started, but I think it works quite well, so I'm going to repeat it now, is Brexit is a bit like quitting your job and becoming self-employed. It does offer you a lot more flexibility, a lot more freedom. There are scenarios in which it could make you richer, in that you pursue this sort of freedom to, work more or do best jobs or whatever. But that isn't going to happen automatically. If you just quit your job and then sit around at home watching daytime TV, you're not going to be any richer. You're going to be poorer. And I think that's actually a bit like what we have done with many of the opportunities we got from Brexit. So if you see the sort of government's priorities when it comes to regulation that you couldn't do inside the EU, you have things like banning the export of live sheep to France. Now, you can think that's a very nice thing to do because, English sheep have the right to be killed in England rather than in a French abattoir. But that is not the sort of thing that's going to lead to growth. Again, things like taking VAT off ebooks. That is something that is much more straightforward to do when you're outside the EU than inside the EU. But that really isn't going to do much for the economy as a whole. And I think the problem overall, whether Britain is inside the EU or outside the EU, is pro-growth policies are just really not a priority over other policy objectives. Now, you can say that's fine. You can go to the public and say, look, Britain is a relatively wealthy country. We're fine here. We're not going to get any richer. Now we're just going to sort of engage in a period of national senescence, and we're just going to have comfortable stagnation and look after wild birds or whatever it is we want to prioritize. But I don't think many politicians have made that case, but they just haven't done enough to actually try and pursue growth.
Yeah, up to that point, I do accept the self-employment analogy. And purely in economic terms, it works. It's not a policy in its own right. It just gives you a broader range of options that you had before. In itself, there is some loss because, and in this case, because there is less economic integration, it can be balanced out, but you have to do quite a lot. And that's what the disagreement here within the Institute has always been about. That I've always told our most pro-Brexit colleagues, look, if Brexit is going to mean or had a good chance of meaning what you think it means, if you were in charge of Brexit, I would be the hardest Brexiteer. What I'm saying is it will not mean that. And the things that we agree should happen and are now maybe possible on the regulatory side are not going to happen because the political appetite for it is not there. Now, some of the later modeling does include the effects of the trade deals with Australia and other economies in the Pacific. And that's all well and good. Once you include that, it looks a little bit better, but it's just not enough to move the needle. That's the problem with it. It's too small in aggregate terms.
And as if to prove your point, move us on to our next topic about where the political will lies. There has been a poll this week that YouGov did on all of the sort of how many tax ideas are there? Sort of 10, 15. On what would be the most popular with the British public, and it rattles through quite a lot of things, including a wealth tax and abolishing stamp duty, replacing it with a land tax, reducing the top rate of tax, taxes on exits and mansions, etc. So there's quite a lot there. Kristian, do you want to run us through it and give us your headline take?
Yeah, I guess there's two ways of summarizing it. One way would be the bad tax reforms are popular and the good ones are unpopular. The other way to summarize it would be people like taxes that they think they won't have to pay. They will be paid for by someone else. So if you look at the top three by, both total support and net approval, so supporters minus opponents, they're all variations of the same thing. So the first one, by far, by quite a margin, the most popular tax proposal of all, at least in this selection here, is the wealth tax. 75% in favor, only 12% against it. And then the next two are basically variations or subcategories of that. So the mansion tax is back again. You could say that is like a component of what a wealth tax is going to be. The other one is the exit tax for people who relocate for tax reasons. That is, not a subcategory, but that would be more like a correlate of a wealth tax. And some of the people who support wealth taxes have been saying that if you do that, you need to couple it, you need to combine it with an exit tax so that people don't run away. So those are all parts of the same package. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, the flat tax is the least popular proposal, reducing the top rate of tax, also net disapproval. Even though this is one of those things so this is about the additional rate or whatever it's called, the 45% income tax rate. That is where even the IFS said a few years ago it's quite possible that this doesn't actually raise any revenue. There we might be and you can overdo the Laffer curve logic. There is such a thing as naive Lafferism. We've talked about this before, but when it comes to income tax rates at that level, it's quite plausible that we're getting close to Lafferite territory where behavioral responses might be strong enough to make sure there isn't much of a revenue gain. And then strangely, because stamp duty is actually quite unpopular.
That's one surprising thing.
Yes. So the idea of abolishing stamp duty and replacing it with a land value tax, that is also unpopular, although not by a massive margin. This could just be because most of the time, even though stamp duty is unpopular, it could be that most of the time people just think, if you're not currently thinking of selling your home, if that's not a realistic prospect for you, you might just think this doesn't concern me. Land value tax, if you're a homeowner, probably would. Although this would really be a big improvement because, land value taxes in general have the upside of being a bit like user charges. So ideally, that's what you want taxes to be like. Where, say, imagine you own a home, and it's near where the Elizabeth line now is, where surely because of that investment, your property value will have gone up a lot, even though you haven't contributed anything to that. And under a land value tax, you would be charged for that extra value that's created by things that happen around you without you contributing to it. But if you make improvements yourself, if you massively renovate your house and make it much nicer, then that would not increase your land value tax burden, because, well, that's it's purely a tax on the unimproved value of the land per se. It would be ideal actually to replace council tax with something like that. Mm-hmm. But council tax is in there too. That's also quite popular, reform council tax, so that it's proportionate to the exact value of the home. That's popular. That surprises me a bit. Maybe people underestimate, maybe some homeowners in London and the Southeast underestimate what this would mean for them. Because if you did this in a revenue neutral way, say, council tax right now is something like 5% of total tax revenue. If you said, we want to keep that where it is, we don't want to raise any more, but not any less either. We just want to rebalance it in such a way that it tracks the value of the property, then, because that was the original idea. Well, it would, of course, mean London, Southeast, massive increases. If you live in the north of England, you would pay next to nothing in council tax. In principle, that's the right thing to do. The problem is just, if you do this in one massive step, the issue there is, so imagine council tax had simply remained the way it was initially. So in the early 90s, it was proportional to, it was a tax on the property values as they were at the time, and then you had the big divergence. If it had stayed that way, that would have meant that if you buy a house in London and in the Southeast, and you know that there's a big council tax bill attached to it, that would reduce the asking price, because the seller of that house would know that if you buy that house, there is a recurring bill that comes attached to it. So that would be like if you buy a listed building and it comes with some historical conservation requirements where they say you have to keep this in a particular state, and that costs money. If you know that is of course going to reduce your willingness to pay overall, and the seller knows that, and therefore that's going to be reflected in the house price. So it would have meant, if council tax had always been that way, a lot of people would have bought their home for a lower price than they actually did, because they pay in the form of the higher council tax bill. It's just that when somebody then buys their home without that information, thinking, this means the council tax bill will always be low, and then suddenly politicians come along and say, haha, surprise, it's now going to go up threefold, then you have a problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And also on your point about the sort of the user pays idea, one of the less popular taxes on here was scrapping fuel duty, replacing it with a road use tax, which is interesting because you think fuel duty is one of those things that politicians always want to freeze because it's so popular. But actually the idea of people paying for the roads that they use doesn't seem too popular.
Well, yeah, and that's also an area where you've got a big sort of long-term fiscal bomb under this. I think in total fuel duty accounts for about £20 billion if you add in vehicle excise tax as well. And the issue with that is obviously, okay, you first got the freeze that has been in place, the temporary freeze that has been temporarily in place for 15 years now, or whatever it is. But you've also got the fact that more and more people are switching to electric vehicles. Now, obviously, if you are not filling up your vehicle with petrol or diesel, you're not paying any fuel duty. So I think, and yet, this is what pays for the maintenance at basically all Britain's roads, and then a bit extra on top. So I think there has long been an acknowledgement that at some stage we are going to have to shift to some sort of road pricing system that applies maybe at first just to electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. And then as more people adopt electric vehicles, that sort of more people end up in that system, and the fuel duty issue sort of fades into irrelevance. But it's something that the previous government was putting off. It seems the current government is putting it off as well. There are difficulties with exactly how you implement it. But yeah, that's also something.
I also went back and looked at the most recent, or I could find of the most recent polling that YouGov did on spending cuts, because we talk a lot about the sort of the fiscal illusion about people on the left wanting to tax other people, which this poll certainly speaks to, and people on the right.
Well, it's not just people on the left.
No, it's out of everybody. Exactly, you're right. You're absolutely right.
What good? There's support across voters of all political parties.
Yeah.
So even Reform and the Conservatives, even their members are supporters of Dwell.
Yeah, I mean, I should correct that and say politicians on the left will more likely go against on the left.
Everyone, the public just generally love taxing other people.
They love taxing other people, and they don't like spending cuts on things that they think they use. So the polling, the government, YouGov asked where the government should be looking to save money. Most popular for savings was international aid, followed by welfare benefits, followed by reducing carbon emissions and any money going on that. But cutting spending in healthcare and the NHS receives just 5% approval, and social care 9%, policing and education 5% each, as opposed to international aid at 65%. But again, especially on healthcare and the NHS, that's where all the money's being spent. So once again, this is a little bit like Superhands in Peep Show, where he says, you can't trust people, they voted for the Nazis, and like Coldplay, which I
mean, to be fair, welfare spending, which is the second most popular one,
yes,
because that if you lump pensions in with it, that's about a third of government expenditures.
Yeah, but
yes, I don't think they have pensions into this.
Yeah, welfare means welfare money for people they don't like.
Yeah,
and that's often an issue where what exactly do you count as welfare? You know, there's been polling on this ages ago, but most people don't consider pensions part of it because they think welfare is kind of pejorative, even though. So certainly in the way I use it, it's perfectly value neutral. It just means a transfer organized by the government. There's no judgment involved there. But there are these massive differences in public perceptions. You can also see this in the extent to which benefit income is underreported, and especially for those types of benefits that are unpopular, where the recipients don't even tell if it's for the is it the family resource survey, one of those expenditure surveys where people who receive the benefit don't declare the full amount, whereas for benefits that are, or payments, transfers, whatever, that are more popular, more widely accepted, there's almost no underreporting. So pensioners declare the full amount, because nobody thinks there's any social stigma attached to receiving pensions. Whereas if it's for income support or now universal credit, there you see only about half of it or so is reported.
Yeah. It's interesting as well that the sort of taxing other people thing sort of feeds back into the way you want spending cuts, because you basically want other people to pay for things that you get. Whereas if we moved to one of the arguments, I think, to moving to a model where the tax burden is felt more broadly across everybody, therefore would that potentially have a knock-on effect for where people were willing to see a little bit more spending restraint because they felt more like they were the ones paying for it. So they're quite happy for the pension bill to be quite high because they think we could just raise the money by taxing other people. But if actually it means everybody accepts that it means raising income tax or something, or VAT that everybody pays, then maybe there'll be a little bit more support for more radical spending cuts.
Well, okay, there are places where public spending is very high and broad-based, and where that seems to be a social, where there seems to be a social consensus around it, where that seems to be relatively stable. So Belgium, France, Sweden, I don't think there's going to be a revolution there, a small state revolution, and there high taxes, high spending really does mean high taxes on almost everybody.
Right.
Yeah, they certainly don't do that by just taxing 12 billionaires. It's just that I don't think it would have the same effect here. Here there really is this illusion that we could have French-style, Belgian-style levels of public spending, and you can have 200 billionaires paying for all of that.
Right.
Yeah, Britain is really unusual in Europe. Not so much in our overall tax level, which is a bit lower than many other European countries, but in how much of the burden is not on the average earner.
The progressive.
Our tax system is much, much more progressive than countries like Belgium or Denmark or Sweden. But again, and that's kind of why you seem to get some of these polling results, because for many people, tax just isn't a big burden. If you're an average earner, the burden is, higher than we'd like, but not overwhelming. You're probably facing significantly higher costs in terms of housing. And so you just get this kind of idea that you can raise more and more revenue from other people, and you don't have to have any spending constraint.
And on that note, if I had to put a positive spin on this, or at least on the top result here on the wealth tax, and I don't normally say positive things here, but if I had to, in this case, I'd say if part of this immense popularity of the wealth tax could really be explained by the fact that, at least right now, it's a relatively new idea to most people. It's still relatively unfamiliar, so it's not completely new. We know that there were discussions around this in the 1970s, but most people don't remember that. In the current context, it seems new. And it could be that once this is more widely discussed, it loses some of its attractiveness. Because that's usually the thing with the wealth tax, that the initial impression, all the positive stuff is front-loaded. When you hear about it for the first time, that's when you get all the positives. And once you start thinking about it, that wears off. And I recently read a paper on the wealth tax, which was initially a dissertation by an economics student at the University of Hamburg, where she went through all the practical difficulties with the wealth tax, so the valuation difficulties, the fact that it doesn't raise much revenue, and the administrative complexity, the capital flight, and all that. And then in the conclusion, and that surprised me, she suddenly said, "But I still support it." And I thought, what's going on here? Why? You just gave a series of very good reasons to reject it. And my theory is she probably started as a Zach Polanski, Gary Stevenson type enthusiastic supporter of the wealth tax, and said, I want to write my dissertation on this because this is a great project. I really want to do this. But then, it's a dissertation. It's not an article for The Guardian. She had to take the economic evidence that she found seriously. And I think she, in the end, couldn't bring herself to saying, I've changed my mind. I now hate the wealth tax and I'm going to set up a counter campaign. So you can be pro-wealth tax and being well informed about it. But I think the more you know about it, the more you lose your enthusiasm. So she still sort of supported it nominally, notionally, but with zero enthusiasm. And I had the last weekend, I did a Times Radio interview on the wealth tax notionally against somebody from the Fabian Society. We were supposed to be opponents. It didn't feel that way at all. And I think he must have had a similar experience to this economics student, that he felt obliged. This is the progressive thing to do. I'm supposed to be in favor of it. But he knew about the practicalities. And even if he was notionally pro, it didn't really feel that way.
Yeah. Just to add very briefly onto that, I totally agree that sometimes looking at these sorts of polls, you can feel like, oh, you should just become a doomer, like everything's lost. Democracy means that fiscal responsibility is impossible. But that's really not the case. If you ask people in a poll these questions about a particular tax that they may well have never really thought about before, you often just get a gut reaction. But that doesn't necessarily transfer into how people vote. So it does seem very much at elections, people do want politicians who are at least able to present themselves as being fiscally responsible, who aren't just going to write a massive shopping list and say we're going to pay for it somehow, we'll sort out the details later. And if you look even for example at the coalition government, there, although it's sometimes overstated, the scale of austerity, you did actually get very real cuts to public spending. The share of GDP that was accounted for in state spending did shrink, and Yeah, and many people were predicting that this would inevitably mean that, whoever implemented this program would be out of power for a generation. Well, the Conservatives, as we all know, got a majority in the 2015 general election, improved their position, and all didn't work out great for David Cameron with the losing the Brexit referendum. But it does show that fiscal constraint isn't necessarily a route to electoral oblivion.
Yeah, there is some electoral mileage in being the sort of, sorry, we can't quite afford that party, because people instinctively understand that, and people may claim household fallacy or whatever, but on the doorstep, as they say, election time, those things do ring true. Now we're running out of time, so we're going to rattle into our last topic. Sort of the third, we've talked about Brexit and growth, we've talked about taxes, and now we're going to talk about housing, because this is the IEA podcast. Dan, there's been a panorama documentary this week looking at the government's house building target, which is 1.5 million homes before the end of the Parliament, and whether they're going to hit it. Do you want to talk us through what it looked at, how it was, and what the conclusions were?
Yeah, so this was the panorama documentary, titled The Race to Build 1.5 Million Homes. And I think actually the title gets across that this is actually quite a well-framed documentary. It was actually, I was expecting to find it a bit of a drag, as a lot of BBC documentaries are, especially when you know a bit about the topic. But this actually did rattle through a lot of the main issues that we have with the undersupply of housing in Britain. So it deals with things like environmental regulations to do with nutrient neutrality. So, basically, if you build new houses, people live in them, they create sewage, and then some of that ends up in rivers. Like, you're not creating new people necessarily, but that's one of the issues. And it had lots of good interviews with economists like Paul Cheshire, who's been writing about this issue for decades. It had a very good section on this idea of the grey belt. So it does a really good job actually of highlighting that the green belt is a fairly sort of arbitrary designation of land that is not built on with housing around cities. It's not an area of outstanding natural beauty. They are not necessarily even very pleasant to live on. They had an interview with a developer who was trying to build houses on a golf course that had been disused since 2017, including on the site of the clubhouse, which had been demolished and was just a pile of rubble. So yeah, it covered an awful lot of good ground, and approached this issue broadly, I think, as many in the sort of YIMBY movement would like people to approach it. This is a massive problem. We have underbuilt for many, many decades. And now we have this massive deficit in housing, and the government has a target of building 1.5 million houses over the course of this 5-year Parliament. Now, onto how well they're doing. Well, this is where there is much less ground for optimism, because even though, they interviewed Steve Reed, the current housing minister, even though his rhetoric is very good, he's got his build baby build hat and stuff, the actual performance of the government in terms of doing things to free up more housing has been really lackluster. So to hit the target, we basically need to be building 75,000 houses each quarter. Now, the most recent figures from the first quarter of this year show us starting in the whole of the UK, 35,000 houses, new housing starts. So that's less than half what we need to do every single quarter for the last 18 months and throughout the next 36 months. And because there's been a deficit early on, you actually need to go significantly above this. But the direction of travel seems to be, if anything, down. So we've had huge issues, particularly in London, with the establishment of the building safety regulator, which, again, Tory idea, but brought in under this government, where you, because this affects flats primarily, flats that are sort of over 7 stories. We've seen really massive delays in permission for new builds, a 70% rejection rate, which is far, far higher than the rejection rate for ordinary planning permission. And this has meant that in areas where we have the highest demand, where the need for housing is most acute, we've seen a really sharp drop. So far this year, there have been just 4,000 housing starts in the whole of London, which is nowhere near the level we need to meet to actually start digging us out of this hole.
Kristian, can you be the optimist?
Absolutely not. I think you've got the wrong guy here. No, I'll make it even worse. I've read this morning that actually on these building figures, housing starts, housing start figures for London are lower than those for the city of Auckland and New Zealand, even though that they have fewer than 2 million inhabitants. And so even in absolute terms, they're building more than London does. And Auckland, of course, that's not just a randomly picked example. The reason why I'm picking that is that has been held up a couple of times as the closest thing maybe to a YIMBY showcase, because they had this reform which they called upzoning, where you give near automatic planning permission for various densification projects, building more high-rise than was possible before, and where they had an acceleration in house building as a result of that. And you could really see once they started to do that and those additional homes started to come on the market, rents stabilized or certainly fell behind relative to the rest of New Zealand, relative to whether it's the national average or a basket of otherwise comparable cities. So basically, it's Econ 101. It's obvious. It should be obvious. It should be very simple. It's just that precisely because it's so obvious, you get people in the housing commentary world who like to say, haha, that's what you think with your introductory economics textbook. No, you underestimate the complexity of it. It's much more subtle and nuanced than that. No, it's not. It's really the first chapter in the economics 101 textbook. That's all you need. It doesn't get more complex than that. And in places which practice Econ 101, like Auckland, they see what we would predict to see.
What can the government do then to fix this? Is there any hope at all? What should they be sort of buckling down and doing to make sure that 1.5 billion target is hit? Although we've already seen how much of a stretch that might be.
But they need to press on with what they were doing initially, which was the release of additional land, but also now the problem has shifted slightly. So I've been writing about this for ages. I've normally concentrated 99% on the land supply issue because that was the big bottleneck and is obviously still a big factor. But we now also have on top of that this building regulator and the nutrient neutrality regulations, where the idea is just that the government is trying to turn development into a version of everythingism, where every housing development or any other kind of development has to deliver multiple social and environmental objectives at once. It has to contain a high proportion of what they call affordable housing, meaning sub-market housing. It needs to add to biodiversity or at least not have any impact on nutrient neutrality. That's all. And building safety regulations that are at massive costs for trivial or zero improvements in actual safety. That's the kind of thing that's all been made much worse relatively recently. So there you would see big improvements if you just went back to the way things were maybe 5 years ago. There, it's not even something particularly radical.
Yeah, actually, on the affordability, on the affordable housing requirements, which is a particularly big issue in London. One thing that has been sort of briefed over the last few days is the idea that Steve Reed is probably going to reduce those relatively soon, or maybe eliminate them in some cases. So that is actually one area where they do seem to have understood that this is basically acting as a tax on building overall, especially in London.
Although that is also one of the areas where Labour backbenchers are reportedly pushing back on.
Yeah, that's because they have this idea, and a lot of housing campaigners do too. They think affordability is somehow a property of a house itself. So an affordable house is just affordable. It just somehow is in and of itself. So this is almost like a version of the Labour theory of value, where you think value is determined by the number of labour hours contained in a product, and they think affordability is a product of a house itself. And somebody said on Twitter, well, they seem to think that affordable houses are made out of affordium. And no, how affordable or unaffordable a house is, that depends on overall market conditions. It's really not a feature of any one specific building. And therefore, you really need to concentrate on the overall market rather than just have a subset of houses that you label affordable.
Yeah. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you too for watching. Like I said, follow us on Substack to get all of our content straight to your inbox at insider.iea.org.uk. Thanks for joining, and we will see you next time.